Hello and welcome. Today we are wrapping up our curriculum for AP US History, looking at Chapter 30 from AMSCO AP US History, which is all about the conservative resurgence, the presidency of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. So we are very quickly approaching the end of this course. AMSCO AP US History does have a Chapter 31 that talks about the 2000s with the presidency of Bush, Obama, and Trump. I'm going to choose not to cover that chapter and end with the 1980s, the rise of Ronald Reagan, and kind of the birth of the modern Republican Party. Starting as always with some historical context, we last talked in chapter 29, the 1970s, about America's limits as a superpower. The 1970s was, I suppose, a bit of an embarrassing decade for the US, an incredibly high death toll in the war in Vietnam, which we eventually withdrew from. We withdrew from Vietnam in 1975. So not only did the American people have to deal with the incredibly high death toll from Vietnam, they also had to deal with, I suppose, the embarrassment of having lost the Vietnam War. Communism spread throughout the Vietnamese peninsula. And then the Watergate scandal, where President Richard Nixon, Republican Nixon, was found to have spied on his Democratic rivals, and he had helped to facilitate the cover-up. His resignation really stained the image of America around the world. But surprisingly, I think it doesn't actually really permanently tarnish the Republican Party, because Republicans will be in power for 16 of the next 20 years in the White House, which is kind of why this chapter is called A Conservative Resurgence. This graph was trying to put the deaths of Vietnam in perspective, 58,000 deaths in the Vietnam War, just on the heels of 36,000 killed in Korea. Now, quite a bit less than the world wars. What I always find this eerie, this graph was probably made in June or July of 2020. I'm filming this in March of 2021. Those deaths from COVID, last summer might have been listed at 83,000 today. When I looked it up this morning, it was at 550,000. And so unfortunately, COVID-19 would now stand as the number 2 most deadly war or pandemic in US history. So anyways, to type up our context here, the US had reached its limits as a superpower, I'll say, in the 1970s, the failed war in Vietnam with the incredibly high death toll there, and then the resignation of Nixon after Watergate. I should also add that the death toll from Vietnam, not as high as the death toll in World War I or World War II, but the war in Vietnam was televised at home. The death toll would be the front headline, the top headline of every single newspaper every morning. The evening news would lead, the lead story every single night would be the carnage in Vietnam. And so even though the death toll in Vietnam might not seem all that high compared to the world wars, the American people could not escape its carnage because of newspapers and news and things like that. Gerald Ford, Republican Gerald Ford, was the vice president under Nixon, who became president after Nixon's resignation. And he's kind of a forgotten president. One of the first things he did was he pardoned Nixon for Nixon's involvement in the Watergate scandal. In Gerald Ford's words, this was to end the national nightmare, the scandal around the presidency. But what it really did was kind of tarnished his reputation and really prevented him from ever having much of a chance to get things done. So his domestic policy was kind of shot on arrival or dead on arrival, and his foreign policy also encountered several failures. 1975 is when the US officially withdrew from Vietnam. They pulled all of their troops and personnel out of Saigon in South Vietnam. And then after that, after we withdrew, there was a horrible genocide in Cambodia. The dictator Pol Pot killed 1 million people, led to 10 million refugees. The US did nothing to help them. And in fact, our bombing of Cambodia helped to create the instability that led to Pol Pot taking power. But communism does not spread beyond Vietnam. And so the fear was that, once Vietnam was communist, domino theory, communism would spread to Indonesia, to the Philippines, to Cambodia, to Laos. It doesn't. Now, that was a small silver lining for President Ford, because he had these kind of humiliating embarrassments before that. So he pardons Nixon to end the national nightmare. So he's really characterized by that, and then he's also characterized by several foreign policy embarrassments, especially the fall of Saigon and the genocide in Cambodia. Sometimes called the Khmer Rouge, which was the name of the group that took power in Cambodia. So Ford's a bit of a forgotten president. Jimmy Carter, Democrat, takes over after that. He's in power for just one term. Jimmy Carter, another one of those somewhat forgotten presidents. Jimmy Carter's fascinating. He was a Southern Democrat, which was quite common up until the last 20 years. Southern Democrat from Georgia. He owned a peanut farm, and when he became president, he sold his peanut farm because he wanted to make it clear that an American president should not have any private business dealings. That story kept on being brought up during Trump's presidency because Trump refused to sell any of his businesses, whereas Jimmy Carter did. Jimmy Carter, still alive. He is very active in building homes for Habitat for Humanity. So Jimmy Carter, nice person, kind of a great symbol of the morals of America. And he had some wins, but one embarrassing defeat at the end of his presidency. So anyways, Jimmy Carter wins the election of 1976. Huge support from Black voters, which kind of becomes a Democratic part of the Democratic base. And also, a lot of Americans were just frustrated after the corruption of Watergate and Nixon and Ford's pardon. And so Jimmy Carter wins, defeating Ronald Reagan in the presidential election. And Jimmy Carter is all about a new approach to foreign policy, shifting away from imperialism, away from the US going to war, which had been the US foreign policy since the 1940s, since post-World War II, and instead shifting towards human rights. So Jimmy Carter is probably most well-known. His biggest win, the biggest feather in his cap, was the Camp David Accords, which was a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. Israel was created as a Jewish state in 1948, but it was plopped right in the middle of several Arab majority Muslim nations who felt like their land was being taken from them. So Jimmy Carter is really the first American president to make any progress towards peace in the Middle East. Might not totally last, but this is an important first step. He also focused on human rights in Latin America and Africa, using his power to pressure Latin American and African governments to increase human rights. And he also decided to gradually transfer control of the Panama Canal, which the US owned and operated and profited from, began to gradually shift control of that to Panama. Panama would fully take over about 20 years later. So those were Jimmy Carter's wins. Whoops. So his foreign policy shifts away from imperialism and towards more focus on human rights. The Camp David Accords was a peace treaty or a peace agreement between Egypt and Israel that he helped facilitate. But the one big stain on his record was the Iran hostage crisis. Very long story short, Iran had several revolutions, but Iran eventually ended up with an extremist, a Muslim extremist, I suppose, who took power in Iran. And some Iranian militants captured 50 Americans at the US Embassy and held them hostage for 444 days and refused to give them up. The rest of Jimmy Carter's presidency would be him trying to free the hostages, and he would not. The hostages were not actually freed until Jimmy Carter left office and his successor, Ronald Reagan, took office. And so despite all of the good things that Jimmy Carter accomplished, despite the progress that he made in foreign policy and diplomatic relations with other countries, and despite the decency that he brought back to the White House after the embarrassments of Nixon and Watergate, this one crisis, and it was a big crisis, but this one crisis, the Iran hostage crisis, tarnished his reputation and ruined any chance he had of a second term. So we'll say 50 hostages, or 50 Americans held hostage for 444 days. Those hostages, again, would be released under Reagan's presidency, which we'll get to right now. So yeah, election of 1981, Ronald Reagan wins relatively overwhelmingly. The Democrats had a short term in the White House, but the Iran hostage crisis kind of ruined their chances, I suppose, of future governance. Ronald Reagan, Republican from California, his presidential library is in Simi Valley, just half hour from our school. He was an actor. He was a cowboy. He was a celebrity. Played football, and he became, after being governor of California, became president in the 1980s. And Ronald Reagan's presidency really signaled the resurgence of conservatism. I think like liberalism, modern democratic principles really became the guiding principle of like the mid 1900s, the New Deal, the Great Society, big government programs to help people. After Reagan, with the 1980s on, new conservatism kind of becomes the dominant ideology in America. The basics of this resurgence of conservatism is no big government. He wanted a small government. He opposed big government. He opposed New Deal liberalism. So like he was against big federal programs. He opposed gun control. He opposed feminism, women's rights. He opposed gay rights. He opposed welfare. He opposed affirmative action, which I'll dig into in a second. He opposed abortion. And so Reagan really is, well, let me get this in here real quick. So Reagan's election kind of signaled the resurgence of new conservatism. And so there was social conservatism. He was against gay rights. He was against abortion, against the demand for equal women's rights, and also against affirmative action, which affirmative action basically allowed colleges to look at an applicant's race to try to have a student body that was more diverse. Ronald Reagan rejected that. He said, the idea today is that it's reverse racism, discriminates against white people. We won't fully get into the debate around that, but that was kind of emblematic of social conservatism, going back to more traditional ideas and rejecting these social changes. And then in terms of economic conservatism, he was, he was against big government spending, and he was against high taxes. Whoops, so sorry, that's more, whatever, political conservatism and economic conservatism. So there's like, so he tries to shrink federal programs, basically. Reagan takes a hard stance against taxes. Prop 13 in California basically limited property taxes. Prop 13 is a huge issue today because really wealthy areas can get a lot of money from property taxes, which property taxes is what oftentimes funds schools, whereas poorer areas cannot get as much property taxes. And so oftentimes schools in poorer areas have less funding because of Prop 13. And a lot of the reasons why Reagan was able to kind of ride the wave of this new conservatism was because of a religious revival in the 1980s. There kind of became to be the rise of like evangelical Christians, Pat Robertson, Oral Roberts, and Jerry Falwell, who had these huge mega churches, and they had They would broadcast their sermons on television every single Sunday or every single day, really, to people. So there's a huge religious revival. This is sometimes called evangelical Christians, that kind of leads the fight for more conservative values. This quote, I think, best captures how Reagan felt about the federal government. He said the most terrifying words in the English language are, the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." When he took office, he said his goal was to get the government off the backs of the people. Low taxes, no laws or fewer regulations on guns, no laws regulating morals like gay rights laws or things like that. I always find this quote really interesting because, I mean, he's the president. He is the U.S. government, but he's basically saying, no, I don't want the federal government in your lives. I want you to be free to make your own decisions away from government control. Can certainly have a conversation around whether or not he's right, or whether the federal government can actually play a positive role in people's lives. But maybe that's a debate for another day. Reagan is probably most known, either famous or infamous, loved or hated, for his approach to economics, sometimes called Reaganomics or supply-side economics. Reagan, when he took power, he promised to lower taxes and he promised to cut government spending. And he did those things. This shows us the top marginal tax rate. You can see it was 70% at one point. Once Reagan takes office, it drops from 70% all the way down to 28%. So he is slashing taxes for the wealthy. Top marginal tax rate, meaning for the top income brackets. So he drastically cuts taxes for the wealthy, decreasing taxes for the wealthy by 70%, let's call it. And that was his approach. His approach was, if we cut taxes and if we reduce government spending, that will actually stimulate the economy, because then businesses will have more money. They're not paying as much taxes. Businesses will have more money, so they'll create more jobs. They'll produce more goods. This was the exact opposite of Keynesian economics. This was the exact opposite of capital D democratic economics, of the New Deal and the Great Society, which says the government should spend money in the New Deal and the Great Society to stimulate the economy. And Reagan's theory was trickle-down economics. If we cut taxes for the wealthy, if we cut taxes for corporations, they'll have more money, they'll have more profits, and then those benefits will trickle down to the poor. Businesses, because they're going to have more profit, they'll be able to pay more. They'll be able to hire more. They'll be able to create more factories. Trickle-down economics is still very popular among the modern Republican Party, but really every single economic study says it does not work. When you cut taxes for the wealthy, when you cut taxes for corporations, all it does is it makes the wealthy richer. It makes businesses richer, and they do not actually raise wages. And so what we really see, and this graph shows us, is that income inequality drastically increases during Reagan's presidency. This shows us the growth rates of income households from basically during Reagan's presidency plus the next decade or so. So the bottom 80%, of Americans saw, minuscule growth. The top 20% saw growth, but really it's the top 1% that saw huge economic growth. And so this idea of supply-side economics, Reaganomics, trickle-down theory, cutting taxes for the wealthy, cutting taxes for the businesses, this is a cornerstone of modern Republican policy. Donald Trump did the same thing. One of his signature policies was a corporate tax cut. Every single economic study shows it does not work. It actually creates more economic inequality and does not help the poor. But I suppose I'll get off my soapbox with my facts and let you all make up your own mind. So Reaganomics or supply side economics, but basically the idea that the government should cut taxes and cut government spending to stimulate the economy. This is the opposite of the democratic approach, which is all about government spending, like the New Deal and the Great Society. And it ultimately led to more income inequality. The rich got richer, the poor got poorer, relatively speaking, at least. Regardless of how you stand on this and whether or not you think the government should cut spending and whether or not you think government should cut taxes for the wealthy, this became Reagan's signature approach and became the kind of platform of the Republican Party through today. In terms of foreign policy, Reagan also oversaw essentially the end of the Cold War. Jimmy Carter, remember Jimmy Carter tried to shift the US away from being an imperialist war-going nation. Reagan goes the opposite direction. While he's cutting government spending for food stamps and welfare, he's drastically increasing spending for the military. Military spending nearly doubled in his first term. So he beefs up the US military. He creates the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, nicknamed Star Wars. There was a series of satellites and lasers in the air, essentially, that would be able to shoot down any missile launched by the Soviet Union. It didn't work. The technology did not work, but all this did was it escalated the arms race with the Soviet Union. And so tensions in his first term with the Soviet Union increased even more after a decade of détente. Ultimately, though, the Cold War will end under Reagan's presidency. Mikhail Gorbachev is elected the Soviet premier in 1985. Mikhail Gorbachev was a reformer, and he immediately sought to grant more freedoms to people, allowed more private businesses, allowed freedom of travel. And so in Reagan's second term, because he's working with Gorbachev, who was willing to reform, they signed treaties that removed intermediate range missiles. And in 1988, the Berlin Wall was torn down. East and West Berlin were reunited. Reagan is often given credit for this, or I suppose Reagan often took credit for this. He had a famous speech in front of the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, in front of the Berlin Wall, where he spoke to Mr. Gorbachev and he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And in 1988, the Berlin Wall did come down. It was broadcast on global television for the whole world to see. And so Reagan took credit for ending the Cold War. It was one of his big, feathers in his cap, one of his big successes. Now, did he end the Cold War? You can get into a debate of that. My theory is that Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet Union, he's the one who made the decision to end the Cold War. He's the one who made the decision to grant more rights to people. But facts get in the way sometimes. Reagan took credit for that. The Republican Party took credit for that. And so they benefited from that. So we'll say the Cold War ultimately ended under Reagan. In his first term, there's increased government spending, especially with Star Wars. But his second term, the Berlin Wall comes down. There's more negotiations, more diplomacy with the Soviet Union. Now, at first glance, this might seem like, Reagan's foreign policy was a huge success. But just like Jimmy Carter had his embarrassment with the Iran hostage crisis, Ronald Reagan has his own embarrassment with the Iran-Contra affair. Reagan completely rejected Jimmy Carter's approach to foreign policy. Reagan was all about rebuilding the U.S. military, creating new missiles and planes and battleships and things like that, and fighting wars or helping to facilitate wars around the world. And the most consequential and embarrassing moment for Reagan was the Iran-Contra affair. Very long story short, as this map helpfully tells us, the US sold guns to Iran secretly, illegally, and then used the profits from those gun sales to send to the Contras, who were rebels fighting in a civil war in Nicaragua. The US, by law, was not supposed to send weapons to Iran and was not supposed to send any aid to the Contras. And so this was doubly illegal. Sending weapons and arms sales to these two countries was illegal. And then Reagan covered it up. And was eventually, revealed by the press and some congressional investigations. There's a whole nother question of, Reagan sold weapons to the Iranians, and coincidentally enough, Iran released those 50 hostages just a bit before that. And so I don't know if it's ever been proven, but there were lots of people who that they connected the dots. Iran released some hostages, we sold them weapons. Don't know if it's ever been proven, but lots of people thought Reagan sold Iran these weapons in order to have the hostages released, which the U.S. is not supposed to negotiate with, with terrorists or hostage takers. With the Iran hostage crisis, several government officers were convicted, but as we oftentimes see, the next president, George H.W. Bush, Republican, pardoned all of them. Photograph of the congressional hearing. And the Iran-Contra affair, at least to his critics, exposed Reagan as corrupt, easily manipulated by his government officers, that he had a lack of control over his officers. Still didn't totally tarnish his legacy, at least among Republicans, because of his economic achievements and cutting taxes and whatnot. But so the Iran-Contra affair, Reagan, or the US government under Reagan, illegally sells weapons to Iran and sends profits from the arms sales to the Contras in Nicaragua. Illegal on both sides. If I can spell Nicaragua right. And this really exposed the corruption of Reagan and maybe his lack of control over his own government. And so from a foreign policy, from a domestic policy, Reagan slashed taxes and cut government spending, which benefited the wealthy and hurt the large majority of Americans. And in terms of his foreign policy, it's a mixed bag. Some successes. The Berlin Wall came down, more negotiations with the Soviet Union, but also this really embarrassing Iran-Contra affair that exposed the U.S. of illegally selling weapons. We were basically an illegal arms dealer to other countries. The last thing to touch on with Reagan is social issues of his presidency. So again, there is this conservative resurgence, this conservative revival in the 1980s. Reagan kind of rides on the coattails of that conservative wave to advance his social agenda. So he attacked abortion rights. Abortion had just been declared constitutional after the Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade, and Reagan really became the leader of the pro-life movement, which, again, today, modern Republicans, what do they believe in? That they're against abortion, generally speaking, and they are against big government spending. They're against high taxes. All of these modern Republican beliefs really were gained center stage during Reagan's presidency. So Reagan kind of launches or becomes the leader of the pro-life anti-abortion movement. He also ignored the AIDS epidemic. AIDS first became, a huge problem in his first term. It was clear in the early 1980s that AIDS was that AIDS was already a huge problem and that it was killing tens of thousands of people. And Reagan ignored it. I believe it might have been his spokesperson, not Reagan specifically, but Reagan's spokesperson called AIDS the gay plague, basically saying, we're not going to deal with it. It's the gay plague, which is horrifying in a lot of ways. And Reagan never actually publicly mentioned AIDS until 1985, when 40,000 people had already contracted it. About half of them had already died from it. Presidents have a lot of power. They have a lot of influence. And if Reagan had decided to make AIDS, a something to fight against, if he had made it a public relations issue that the U.S. government needs to fight against, the U.S. certainly would have saved tens of thousands of lives, because they could have invested in the scientific research to figure out how it spread and how to stop it. They could have invested in programs to help those who had AIDS. They could have invested in research to come up with cures and treatments. But Reagan did not. He eventually did those things. He eventually did invest a decent chunk of money in his second term, but he spent his entire first term silent on it, as tens of thousands of people died. Again, another one of the criticisms of Reagan, at least from many liberals. And then amidst his presidency, and also a little bit before and a little bit after, the gay rights movement really launches in America. Really launched in 1969 after the police attacked the Stonewall Inn, which was a gay bar in New York City. And we see gradual progress here. In the 1970s, homosexuality is no longer listed as a mental illness, which is insane that it took that long. But then in the 90s, President Clinton, who was a Democrat, he tried to let gay people serve in the military, but his solution, or I suppose his compromise, was a policy called "Don't Ask, Don't Tell," which basically meant the military is not going to ask if you're gay, and you're not going to tell us if you're gay. And as long as you don't mention it, we'll let you serve. Like, on a surface level, that was a good thing because it let gay people serve in the military. But what it really did was it forced them back into the closet. If you were openly gay, you could not serve. Obama eventually did repeal "Don't Ask, Don't Tell," and so gay people can now openly serve in the military. And the new civil rights fight, I suppose, in America is over transgender rights. There was a debate. Trump said that transgender people cannot serve in the military. Biden repealed that, so that's kind of the modern day fight. So we'll just say here that he also fought for conservative social issues. So he led the pro-life movement against abortion, and he ignored the AIDS epidemic for his first term. I don't know if that fits under fighting for conservative social issues. It doesn't really, but he was against gay rights. Again, he called it the, quote, "gay plague," end quote. And so you can certainly make a logical assumption that maybe that's why he didn't speak up, because it was only affecting the gay population. To wrap us up with our last couple of slides, one of the big changes that we see from the 1980s until modern day is a growth in immigration, and specifically a growth in immigration from regions other than Europe. In the 1960s, most immigrants to America came from Europe or Canada. They were white immigrants. But by the 1980s, 47% of immigrants come from Latin America, 37% come from Asia. This graph shows us the red bar is how many immigrants come from Europe. And so you can see, huge wave in the 1900s and 1910s of European immigrants. decreases during the Great Depression. But then you really see the 1960s, but then really the 1970s, 1980s, a huge increase of non-European, non-white immigrants. That trend only accelerates if you were to look at today's number. So a huge increase in immigration from non-white, non-European places. And much of that was because of a policy that LBJ passed in his Great Society, which was the Immigration Act, which ended ethnic quotas, which basically opened up immigration to all parts of the world. And this increase in immigration really leads to a new civil rights push, kind of exemplified by Cesar Chavez and the UFW, United Farm Workers Organization, that fought for the rights of farmers, especially Latino farmers in California and in America. Now, this growth in non-white immigration, it is changing America. And it's also, this isn't something that we're going to explore in depth, but it's also, led to a backlash from a lot of conservative white people. If you think about, how was Donald Trump, with all of his hateful rhetoric, how was he able to become president? Well, much of that is because a lot of conservative white people, they look at the changing America. They look at the changing population, changing demographics of America, and they feel threatened by that. Whether they are right to be threatened or not is up for you to decide, but America is changing. It is less of a white nation. It is more of a diverse nation. And that leads to incredible things with diversity, and also that threatens the way of life for some people. So when we're talking about our social changes, there is a growth in immigration from non-European places in the 1980s. So I don't know, 47 plus 37. So 85% of immigrants come from Latin America. Latin America or Asia in the 1980s. And then our last slide, we're not going to fully dive into all of these presidents, but just to briefly tell the story, the 90s and the 2000s, alternating back and forth between a Democrat, a Republican, a Democrat, Republican with Trump, and a Democrat with Biden. George Clinton, Democrat from Arkansas, one of the last Southern Democrats, really. He balanced the budget. That was his big signature achievement. The federal debt did not increase under George Clinton. Oh my God, I said George Clinton? Dear Lord. As I'm saying that, that sounded so wrong. His name is Bill. His name is William. Yeah, his name's Bill. Okay, cool. Bill Clinton balanced the budget. We also saw a huge technology boom under Clinton's presidency. The internet was born. Different people will take claim for it. Al Gore, Clinton's VP, oftentimes bragged that he invented the internet because he invested in funding. But then Clinton was also impeached for having an affair with a White House intern, Monica Lewinsky, in the 90s. George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush, is most known for his war on terror. 9/11 happened just 9 months into his presidency, and so much of his 8 years was spent fighting wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the war on terror. And then Obama. Obama was really all about trying to get back to old democratic principles of big government programs to help people. So the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, the economic stimulus package that helped to get us out of the 2009 recession. But we also saw a huge increase in polarization. The birth of the Tea Party movement, which was a super conservative wing of the Republican Party that kind of fought very strongly for conservative issues, small government, low taxes, no gay rights, and things like that. So we're not going to get into all of these specific presidencies, but what we're ultimately seeing is, I'm trying to summarize this in a bullet shell, like the modern Democratic and Republican parties are born. The Democratic Party is all about, government spending, government programs to help people, active in kind of spreading social issues. And the modern Republican Party is much more about small government, low taxes, and also increased military spending, as we saw with W. And so as we wrap up our chapter 30, we've got the rise of Ronald Reagan, the rise of new conservatism, but also some stains both on his presidency and on the previous presidents, Jimmy Carter's, and then some modern day changes.